So, 2024. What a interesting year. Not even discussing the news or the big events, but just personally, this one has been a tough year to get through. I won't even get into all of it, but to keep it short, it was wild and honestly, there was just a lot that ended up being disappointing or not really what I planned. But regardless, I'm feeling a bit festive. And I feel like it's time to change the mood around here for once, and actually talk about something positive. Because, you know, it gets kinda tiring just talking about fake Bluey content slop, or horrific knockoffs that haunt my nightmares. And I'm not entirely over the fact that my magnum opus of re-ranking every Bluey character more or less totally flopped in views, but for a change of pace, I'm gonna forget about it and try to be happy because, you know, Christmas is coming up, and whether you celebrate that or the many other holidays around this time, I think there's something to look forward to. And with that, I thought it would be fun to talk about some more Bluey episodes, with of course, our main focus being, appropriately, episodes centered around holidays. There's been a few of these produced throughout Bluey's run, and personally, I find them interesting as they kind of give off their own vibes compared to the others. And with us now being months and even a few years away from their release, I wondered if these episodes still held up after all this time, and if they're still worth checking out. So without a further ado, we'll do exactly that, and begin, starting with our first episode, Veranda Santa. Beginning at the very first holiday episode produced, I actually haven't seen this one in a while, and honestly, after rewatching it, it's actually way better than I remembered. Being a season 1 episode, I thought this one would end up being the weakest, as the earlier episodes tend to be a lot more simple. But this one, while yes having a kinda simple premise, is actually a ton of fun. And in my opinion, one of the funniest the show has to offer. From beginning to end, this episode is just filled with a lot of hilarious moments, and I swear I'm not just saying that because Uncle Stripe gets hurt over and over again.
Don't worry about what...
But even outside of Stripe getting relentlessly hurt, the other characters are pretty good too. Especially Bluey, who just does not hold back for anything in this episode. She refuses to accept Bingo's apology after the two fight over a pencil case, she intentionally tricks everyone into losing the game they're playing, and she goes out of her way to not leave a present for Socks after she accidentally bites her. Which is something I kind of forgot Socks used to do back then. But overall, Bluey is actually kind of a menace in this episode. And looking back, it's actually really funny cause in the future episodes where she's like super nice and stuff, you don't kind of really expect it, but it is pretty interesting. Although, of course, she does learn her lesson to forgive others, with her going out to meet Socks after she's left disappointed, where the two have a pretty sweet moment together and all is resolved. And in general, outside of the humor, it's actually a pretty nice, chill story, with most of the other family just hanging out in the warmth of the healer house, which, by the way, looks especially gorgeous in this episode. The warm colors and all the detailed decor gives off such a cozy vibe. And on top of that, the soundtrack is also pretty nice too, with lots of both calm and upbeat tunes that perfectly fit the holiday atmosphere. So overall, Veranda Santa is an honestly pretty good episode, even years later. And I'm surprised I've kinda slept on this one for this long, but it's definitely a decent holiday episode, and one that honestly deserves its status as a longtime classic for the show.
Oh yeah, I love spelling about vibe.
So the show, as in like the episode called the show, is one that I wasn't planning on putting here because it's not really about a specific holiday, but the episode itself does take place on Mother's Day, and it is kinda about Chili, the mom of the show, so I thought, it's close enough, let's talk about this one. And oh boy, is there a lot to talk about. Probably the thing people most remember from this episode is that one scene where the balloon pops, because there were a ton of people who theorized that it actually represented Chili having a miscarriage, something that I think Joe Brum, the creator, actually confirmed, which if you think about it is actually kinda wild. Like, they just dropped this admittedly pretty dark lore as a subtle hint in one episode and mentioned nothing else. And honestly, up until it was confirmed, I didn't even believe it all that much. But now looking back at it, I can actually kinda see how it fits with the episode. The whole story is about learning to pick yourself up and move on, which is a pretty standard message you see in an average kids show, but I think Bluey does take it up a notch because it's also aimed towards the parents in a way, as Chili is the one who teaches Bingo about picking herself up in the first place, with her only knowing this from personal experience. And perhaps, maybe that personal experience was her coping with the loss of her first child? But hey, that's just a theory. Semi-confirmed but still partially ambiguous theory. My favorite. And not only does the show have that going for it, but we also shouldn't forget that this episode is actually a lot of fun too. The banter between Bluey, Bingo, and even the parents is hilarious. And the idea of them improvising Bandit and Chili's story until everything goes completely off the rails is a brilliant idea. And even then, I honestly think that this one is just one of the most enjoyable episodes of season 2, just because of how great it is. It's not some crazy adventure or deep heavy hitter, but it doesn't really need to be, as it honestly serves perfectly as a fun, humor-based episode with some wholesome moments, and even a very subtle hint of something deeper for the parents watching. A hint that I'd argue is actually somewhat dark and unexpected, but still matches with the episode's lesson about learning to recover from setbacks or tragic moments. And overall, while it's really not directly about Mother's Day that much, I do think it's a fitting episode for the occasion regardless, as Chili does get a decent amount of attention, and of course, also serves as one of the two parents in the show Bluey and Bingo put on. Also, speaking of that other parent, I know this isn't about him, but I've always had one question about Bandit in this episode, which is that, where in the world did they just happen to find baby stuff in his size? And why do they already have it at their house? And yes, I know, the true answer is just cartoon logic, you dumb dog. But I just can't help but think that something else is going on here. And I think Bandit owes us an explanation. I mean, do you know how much fan art people are gonna draw because of this? DeviantArt's gonna have a field day. We gotta stop him before it's too late. So to wrap up season 2, with the exception of one episode we'll surely get to, we have our second Christmas episode, Christmas Swim. I don't know why, but I just love saying that title. It just rolls off your tongue so smoothly. But going back to the episode, after rewatching both this one and Veranda Santa, I actually think Veranda Santa is a little bit better, mainly just because I like the calmer vibes of that one more, and I think the main message was emphasized a bit better. But with that said, I'm not trying to diss Christmas Swim at all, because it's still pretty good in its own right. And if anything, it's kinda tricky to compare the two, because despite both being Christmas episodes, they kind of show the occasion in completely different ways, with Veranda Santa showing the more calm, sincere side of the holidays, and Christmas Swim showing the more energetic side with everyone getting cool gifts and just partying together, which I think is a neat idea in itself, and a genius use of the show's often shorter runtime. And speaking of everyone, one thing Christmas Swim does have an advantage of is that we actually do get to see a few more characters. Pretty much everyone has a small role of sorts and gets a moment to shine. Also, unlike Veranda Santa, we actually do get appearances from Nana and the, at the time, still relatively new characters Rad and Frisky, who at this point had only appeared in one other episode, not including pictures and stuff. So to see them actually be a relevant part of the family, and now established to have at least some appearances here and there, was pretty nice. And although Red and Frisky aren't my absolute favorites, even I have to admit that they are lots of fun. And I'm really glad the show decided to keep them relevant, as opposed to just using them once and forgetting about them like some shows would. In fact, I kind of wonder if they were always intended to be semi-frequent characters, or if they really were only meant to serve like one role or two, but just kind of caught on as fan favorites. Knowing how smart Joe Brum and the other writers are, I would assume the former because it all eventually came so well together with the signed a whole season later, but honestly, I can see it happening either way. Regardless though, it was pretty nice to see them back, and in general, this episode is also quite decent. And just like Veranda Santa, a really fun way to cover the holidays and get into the Christmas spirit. Although with that said, I do have one question about this episode, which is that how do they celebrate 2 Christmas parties in 1 year? Because if you think about it, the characters didn't age until season 3 after both of these episodes, and yet we know they don't take place at the same time because Socks is a little bit more grown up in Christmas Swim. So my theory is that maybe Socks just grew like overnight and everyone just kind of went with it. Or maybe we just have to like rearrange the episodes and say that like Christmas Swim takes place after the events of Pass the Parcel. Or maybe Pass the Parcel takes place in season 2? I'm not really sure what's the right way to arrange it, and it could honestly be its own video, but it is some food for thought, I suppose.
There is something! No, it's just a buh.
So earlier when I mentioned Christmas Swim, you might remember that I said that it wasn't quite the finale of season 2. And this episode is basically why. Because despite coming out months after Christmas Swim, it's still technically considered a part of season 2. And basically the finale. And I remembered that when this episode came out, it was actually kind of a big deal, because looking back, I remember a lot of my friends and others were super hyped for this one. And the fact that this episode actually premiered in Australia and America at the same time was like a super big deal too, because Bluey content releasing everywhere at the same time was, and arguably still is, a pretty rare occurrence.
Bruh.
Mainly just because Disney has this awful system where they only release episodes by season, which makes everyone wait until an entire season finishes day by day in Australia before they decide to drop them, which, considering how absurdly long Bluey seasons are, can take basically forever. And in an era where people are constantly trying to jump on the next big thing and post any spoilers they can for internet points, that was a really painful process, because you know you're just missing out or gonna get the next episode inevitably spoiled. But with that said, it seems like a lot of people are actually okay with this? So maybe it's not as much of an issue as I think it is. But anyways, going back to Easter, I was still pretty early into making YouTube videos at this time. But even back then, I knew I had to make a video about this the moment it came out, just to strike while the iron was hot. Something that surprisingly, I was actually kinda good at back then. And I distinctly remember that I was actually on a family trip to Las Vegas the day it came out, but of course, something like the lights and glamour of Vegas wasn't gonna stop me, and I just watched it on my phone using Disney Plus as we were out and about. And with that said, I think my excitement about it, while somewhat justified, may have overhyped it just a little bit. I remember that I gave this one a super glowing review right after it was released, with this very interesting thumbnail. How did I even make that? But upon rewatching it recently, I don't think it's quite the masterpiece I made it out to be, but it's honestly still a really fun episode. As I mentioned before, Bluey and Bingo work really well in this one, with their strengths working together perfectly, and really showing why they have such a great dynamic in the show. And on top of that, the Easter egg hunt in itself is also lots of fun and super creative. I don't know where Bandit and Chili found the time to even pull half of this off, assuming they made it at all, and overall, this story does kind of feel like an older, classic Bluey episode, with it just being focused on the two sisters figuring things out, but with the upgraded visuals and other elements that we've come to know in newer episodes. Overall, a pretty fun time, and just like the Christmas specials, I think this one also does a great job covering the holiday it's based on, with it of course being a giant hunt and stuff. Pretty Easter if you ask me.
Ticket.
Oh, I don't have one.
So for our final holiday episode, we have Perfect, which takes place on Father's Day, or at least the Australian version of it. I never realized until this episode that different countries tend to celebrate these things on different days, but it's pretty interesting. Anyways though, this episode is, of course, about Bandit. Who could have guessed? And in the spirit of Father's Day, it features the kids trying to make cards for him, with Bluey trying to figure out the perfect drawing to make, hence the title. And similar to Easter, this one also had a somewhat unique release, with it being the opposite and being an early episode of the then upcoming Season 3, with the other episodes not releasing until a couple months later. And funny enough, I coincidentally also made a video on this one, which also happens to have a very bizarre thumbnail.
Wow. Wow.
In retrospect, I honestly regret making this because it may have gone a little bit too far, even for my standards, but in my defense, I swear it makes a lot more sense if you've seen the episode. At least the original uncensored version anyways, because I just rewatched this episode on Disney Plus, and it took me a minute to realize that they completely replaced the joke. Because if you watch the episode, there's one scene where Bandit is talking with Fido, with of course Bluey messing around as he does this. And most people won't even realize this because they're so focused on Bluey, but Bandit and Fido here are actually having a full-on conversation, with Bandit talking about getting some of his dog teeth removed? Which raises a lot of questions like, aren't they already born with dog teeth and just use them as normal? Why would this be an issue? Or is there a difference between regular teeth and dog teeth? And do they have both? Why is he even considering getting them removed in the first place? Are they dangerous or something? And in this talk, he also says that he wants to keep them because he might need them to bite someone? I have so many questions, and honestly, it doesn't make any sense. Especially since Bandit kinda implies it's optional too, and not something like his teeth being diseased or something. But with that said, we'll honestly probably never get an answer for this, because as I mentioned, this is the censored version of the scene, and was likely just a quick fix. Hence why it doesn't really make that much sense. Watching the original version though, it's a completely different subject, with Bandit implying that he wants to get his ability to reproduce removed?
Look, I'm keen to get it done, but Chili, she wants to keep her options open, but I don't know. Do we want any more of these things running around? Hey!
And we thought the lore drop with Chili in the show was crazy, right? I mean, it actually is way more serious, but yeah, this show just does not hold back. And honestly, I kinda love how it just tries to get away with stuff like this. At least outside of Disney Plus anyways, but even outside of those moments, this one is also another simple but really fun episode. And I think it displays the relationship between Bandit and his kids really well, with it definitely not being perfect per se, but still the very best it could be, just like Bluey's drawing. Also, the humor in this one is, of course, great too. Bluey's reaction to her picture getting replaced in the fridge is just iconic, and Bandit telling Bluey not to tell her mom she got hurt is actually one of the most hilarious jokes in arguably the entire show, and one of the most dad things ever. And of course, these moments aren't like super big or super important, but altogether, it just makes this family feel that much more real. and feel like a genuine, actually working group that's just kind of trying their best amongst all of the chaos they put upon themselves, which is arguably one of the reasons why this show is as big as it is now. But overall, while this isn't an episode I really watched that often, I think it served as a simple but fun story for the occasion, and a decent start to what would become a phenomenal season. I mean, just the fact alone that we went from this episode to The Sign, it just blows my mind. Like, I can't even comprehend how this show got such an insane glow up when it was already great to begin with. Like, it's honestly just incredible. But now, with all that said and done, we have covered every holiday episode of the show so far. I'm sure we'll get more as Bluey goes on, but in general, I have to admit that I was actually pretty surprised by how enjoyable some of these episodes still are. Now, of course, it being Bluey, I wasn't expecting them to be bad or just age horribly, but compared to the more deep and intricate stories we're used to now, these older episodes, while arguably a little bit simple, are still a ton of fun, with any lack in story or depth easily being made up for by their witty writing and fantastic sense of humor. Also, not to mention that they are also incredible celebrations of their respective holidays, with them portraying these events in a way that feels very slice of life, while still leaving room for some emotional and very heartwarming moments. So overall, to answer my question, I think that these episodes are still pretty good and have held up really well. So if you haven't seen them yet, I highly recommend giving them a watch. But with that said, I'm curious to hear your opinion on these episodes, and which of these holiday episodes is your personal favorite. Let me know your answer in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and sub if you haven't. But until next time, stay safe everyone, and happy holidays. Goodbye everyone.